The soft clink of a porcelain espresso cup against a saucer. A businessman in a bespoke suit reaches into his jacket. Naomi sees it first. No hesitation, no fear. She swings the solid silver tray like a bat. Crack! The assassin's jaw shatters. Before anyone can process it, she flips a massive oak table, turning luxury into a war zone as suppressed gunfire rips through the Plaza Hotel's sky lobby. Guests scream, glass explodes, and Naomi? Calm, precise, in control. But here's the question. How does a lowly waitress move like a trained weapon in a room full of killers? And why does the most dangerous man in the room suddenly stop when he recognizes her? You're about to witness a story where power shifts in seconds, secrets explode without warning, and one woman rewrites the rules of survival. Hit the subscribe button now because the next move she makes changes everything. Tae-jin, the feared head of the syndicate, drops to the marble floor. His elite bodyguards are gunned down before they can even draw their weapons. He braces for the fatal shot. Instead, he watches his quiet, invisible waitress, the one who just poured his morning espresso, disarm a second shooter with terrifying, calculated precision. She snaps the man's wrist, strips his suppressed pistol, and puts 2 bullets in his chest without blinking. The room falls violently silent, save for the hum of the air conditioning. Naomi steps over the bodies, her eyes locking onto the stunned Mafia boss. It wasn't the rival triads, Naomi says, her voice as cool as the ice water she was serving. It was your underboss, Min-soo. He paid them from your offshore account yesterday. Tae-jin freezes, the betrayal hitting him harder than the gunfire. "Say that again," he whispers. Naomi strips a spare magazine from a dead shooter and tosses it onto Tae-jin's chest. We have exactly 3 minutes before Min-soo's heavily armed cleanup crew breaches those elevators. Are we taking the service stairs, or are you dying here? The crisp snap of a heavily starched collar echoed softly in the staff locker room. Naomi adjusted the black silk bow at her throat, her reflection in the mirror offering nothing but a blank, compliant stare. She was no longer the woman who could strip a tactical rifle blindfolded. She was simply Naomi, premium service staff for the Plaza Hotel's exclusive sky lobby. Camouflage came in many forms, and she had learned that in the world of the ultra-wealthy, the most impenetrable disguise was a serving tray. Nobody looks twice at the help. Stepping out of the service elevator onto the 50th floor, she entered a pristine world of polished mahogany and floor-to-ceiling glass suspended above the morning smog of the city. Naomi moved with practiced, silent grace, aligning crystal water glasses to the exact millimeter on the linen-draped tables. While the other servers gossiped in hushed tones about the billionaire guests, Naomi's eyes swept the room, instinctively cataloging its tactical vulnerabilities. The south-facing emergency stairwell had a 3-second delay on its biometric lock. The VIP section's sightlines were critically obstructed by a massive modern art sculpture, and the private security details hovering near the velvet ropes were complacent, relying far too heavily on the hotel's prestige rather than active vigilance. A sharp, singular vibration against her hip broke her assessment. Stepping into the shadowed alcove behind the gleaming Italian espresso machines, she checked her phone. It was a secure text from the private care facility. Maya's vitals are stable. She slept through the night. Next medical installment due on the 15th. Naomi exhaled, the rigid tension in her shoulders softening for just a fraction of a second. That staggering monthly wire transfer was the only reason she endured the stifling uniform, the demanding guests, and the absolute erasure of her own identity. It kept her younger sisters safe, breathing, and hidden from the ghosts of Naomi's former life. She tapped a brief reply, deleted the encrypted thread, and slipped the phone back into her apron. The vulnerability vanished, replaced once again by the cool, detached armor of the invisible girl. A subtle shift in the room's atmospheric pressure pulled her attention back to the floor. The gold-plated elevator doors chimed, and a chilled silence swept over the morning lounge. Tae-jin had arrived. He didn't just walk, he advanced, surrounded by 4 men whose tailored suits couldn't quite hide the bulk of their shoulder holsters. Naomi recognized the apex predator hierarchy instantly. Tae-jin slid into his usual corner booth, his sharp features set in an unreadable mask, scanning the room with the cold detachment of a man who owned the city beneath him. Naomi picked up her heavy silver tray, placing a porcelain espresso cup perfectly in its center. The golden rule of her survival was simple: never look them in the eye and never leave a footprint. She lowered her gaze and stepped out onto the floor, a ghost walking toward the king. The soft clink of the porcelain espresso cup against the saucer was the loudest sound in Naomi's world for exactly 1 second. She placed it perfectly before Tae-jin, her eyes trained respectfully on the dark mahogany of the table. But peripheral vision was a survival trait you couldn't train out of a ghost. 3 tables away, a man in a bespoke charcoal suit stood up. He didn't look at the breathtaking skyline. His eyes were deadlocked on the back of Tae-jin's head. As the man's hand slipped beneath the lapel of his jacket, the angle of his elbow and the unnatural stillness of his posture screamed intent. It was a textbook draw. Naomi didn't have time to think. The stifling disguise of the compliant waitress fractured instantly, releasing the lethal operator trapped beneath. Balancing the heavy, solid silver serving tray in her hand, she pivoted. She swung the metal platter like a bat, driving the edge directly into the assassin's jaw. Bone shattered with a sickening crunch. Before his limp body even hit the marble floor, Naomi drove her heel into the underside of Tae-jin's massive oak coffee table, kicking it violently onto its side to create a reinforced barricade. A microsecond later, the pristine morning air was torn apart by the rhythmic, spitting hiss of suppressed gunfire. Crystal chandeliers exploded. The ultra-wealthy guests screamed, scrambling for the exits. Tae-jin's elite bodyguards, caught entirely off guard by multiple shooters posing as corporate patrons, were cut down before their weapons even cleared their holsters. Dragged to the floor behind the overturned wood, Tae-jin tasted the bitter dust of shattered plaster. The fearsome head of the syndicate braced himself. He was defenseless, pinned down in his own sanctuary, staring at his inevitable execution. Instead, he watched the impossible. A second shooter flanked their makeshift barricade, raising a silenced pistol toward Tae-jin's head. Naomi didn't cower. She surged upward, catching the barrel of the assassin's gun and twisting it violently outward. The man's wrist snapped with a sharp crack. In one fluid, brutal motion, she stripped the weapon from his ruined grip, stepped into his guard, and put 2 bullets directly into his chest. The lounge fell into a ringing, terrifying silence, save for the hiss of a ruptured espresso line and the distant wail of alarms. Naomi calmly checked the weapons chamber, her breathing perfectly even. She stepped over the bleeding bodies, unfastened her hotel apron, let it drop to the floor, and looked down at the stunned Mafia boss. Tae-jin stared up at her, entirely paralyzed by the lethal, cold-blooded precision of the woman he had never bothered to look at twice. "It wasn't the rival triads," Naomi said, her voice as cool as the ice water she had been serving minutes ago. "It was your underboss, Min-soo. He paid them from your offshore account yesterday." Tae-jin froze, the magnitude of the betrayal hitting him harder than the concussive force of the gunfire. "Say that again," he whispered. Naomi stripped a spare magazine from the dead shooter and tossed it onto Tae-jin's chest. "We have exactly 3 minutes before Min-soo's heavily armed cleanup crew breaches those elevators. Are we taking the service stairs, or are you dying here?" Tae-jin caught the heavy magazine against his chest, the cold steel snapping him out of his paralysis. He didn't ask questions. In his world, hesitation was a death sentence. He slammed the fresh clip into the assassin's dropped weapon and racked the slide. "Move," Naomi commanded, already sprinting toward the frosted glass doors of the kitchen prep area. Tae-jin followed, his polished Oxfords slipping briefly on the blood-slicked marble. They burst through the swinging doors into a labyrinth of gleaming stainless steel. Naomi didn't hesitate at the maze of prep stations. She navigated them with the terrifying muscle memory of a predator who had mapped her hunting ground perfectly. She bypassed the main service lifts, heading straight for a rusted iron grate tucked behind a row of walk-in freezers. She hit the manual override. The heavy freight doors violently rattled open. "In," she barked. Tae-jin stepped inside the claustrophobic metal box. Naomi slammed her palm against the emergency descent lever, bypassing the hotel's electronic grid entirely. The elevator plummeted with a stomach-turning lurch, plunging them into the dim, amber-lit maintenance shaft. The space was agonizingly tight, designed for linen carts rather than two adults running on pure adrenaline. Tae-jin was pressed close, his broad frame practically caging her against the vibrating metal wall. He could smell the acrid tang of gunpowder clinging to her skin, mixed with the faint, delicate scent of the hotel's signature jasmine soap. Her chest heaved, but her eyes, dark, calculating, and entirely devoid of panic, were fixed on the floor indicators flashing downward in the gloom. 48, 47, 46. He watched a single drop of an assassin's blood slide down her sharp jawline. For the first time in a decade, Tae-jin was not the most dangerous person in the room. The realization should have terrified him. He was a kingmaker, a man who had built a ruthless empire on absolute control and unwavering submission from everyone around him. Yet, as Naomi shifted her weight, her arm brushing against his chest to seamlessly check the chamber of her stolen pistol, he felt a strange electric jolt that had nothing to do with the gunfire upstairs. "They'll realize we bypassed the main system and cut the power to these shafts by floor 30, she said. Her voice dropped to a low, tactical murmur as she stared up at the rusted ceiling grate. She finally looked back at him, her gaze piercing right through his expensive, tailored armor. "When the emergency brake hits, we pry that hatch and climb the grease cables to the ventilation vents. Do not drop your weapon and do not slow me down. Understood?" Tae-jin looked down at this beautiful, deadly stranger who had completely dismantled his reality in under 3 minutes. A slow, dangerous smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. He was trusting his life and his throne to a ghost in a waitress uniform. "Understood," he murmured, his voice a low rasp. He realized, with a sudden and intoxicating clarity, that he actually liked taking her orders. The rusted service door groaned as Naomi pushed it open, dragging Tae-jin into the suffocating gloom of sub-level 4. The hotel's abandoned overflow garage smelled of stale motor oil and damp concrete. She shoved him toward a massive support pillar, her stolen pistol scanning the shadows before she finally lowered the barrel. Tae-jin leaned heavily against the concrete, his breathing ragged. His bespoke suit jacket was ruined, a dark, spreading stain blooming across the left shoulder where a suppressed round had grazed him during their frantic descent. "Take it off," Naomi ordered, her voice entirely devoid of panic. She was already tearing a long strip of pristine white fabric from the hem of her ruined uniform blouse. Tae-jin didn't move, his dark eyes locked onto hers, piercing through the dim, flickering fluorescent light. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the cold, hard edge of the syndicate boss. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice a low, gravelly threat. "No waitress recognizes a tactical breach, and no civilian shoots a man twice in the chest without blinking. Jacket, now," she repeated, stepping into his space, completely ignoring the interrogation. He gritted his teeth and peeled the ruined wool off his shoulders, followed by his tie and the blood-soaked dress shirt. The cold garage air hit his skin, but it was Naomi's proximity that made his muscles rigid. She knelt right between his knees, fully invading his personal space. Her fingers were swift and clinical, uncapping a miniature bottle of high-proof vodka she'd swiped from the kitchen prep station and pouring it directly over the raw flesh. He hissed, his hand instinctively gripping her waist to brace himself against the searing pain. He expected her to flinch, to pull away from the heavy touch of a notorious killer. She didn't. Instead, her hands remained perfectly steady as she bound the makeshift bandage tight over his collarbone. The forced physical closeness made the freezing air between them suddenly heavy. Tae-jin looked down. He was close enough to see the rapid pulse beating at the base of her throat and the faint dusting of gunpowder across her cheek. She was entirely unafraid of him. He was a man who commanded an underworld empire, who instilled terror with a single glance. Yet this woman was handling him like a fragile, albeit dangerous asset. The realization didn't anger him, it captivated him. Naomi pulled the fabric taut, the leverage finally forcing her to look up. Their faces were mere inches apart. She braced for the cold arrogance she was used to serving every morning with his espresso. Instead, what she saw in his dark, intense gaze wasn't dominance, it was absolute awe. "You saved my life," Taejin murmured, his thumb brushing a smear of ash from her jaw. His grip on her waist shifted from a reflexive brace to a fiercely protective hold. "You will never have to hide again." The genuine, unfiltered gratitude in his voice hit her harder than any physical blow. For the first time in 3 years, the invisible girl felt truly seen. The stolen matte black Porsche tore out of the subterranean garage, its tires screaming against the damp asphalt as it launched into the neon-drenched arteries of the city. Naomi slammed the shifter into fourth gear. Her face, illuminated by the jagged, rhythmic flashes of passing streetlights, was a mask of absolute, terrifying focus. In the rearview mirror, the blinding high beams of 2 heavy-duty SUVs cut through the mist. Minsu's cleanup crew had caught their scent. A volley of automatic gunfire chewed through the rear windshield, scattering diamonds of tempered glass across the pristine leather seats. Taejin didn't flinch. Ignoring the burning ache in his bandaged shoulder, he kicked out the remaining jagged shards with his heel and braced his stolen rifle against the window frame. He opened his mouth to shout a warning, to tell her to steady the wheel, but the words died in his throat. The moment he leaned out to level his sights on the lead SUV, the Porsche's suspension flawlessly leveled out. Naomi hadn't just held her line, she had watched his posture shift in the mirror and instantly absorbed the car's drift, gifting him a perfectly stabilized, frictionless sniper's perch. Taejin pulled the trigger. The lead SUV's front tire exploded, sending the massive vehicle fishtailing violently into a concrete pylon in a blossoming fireball. He dropped back into the passenger seat as Naomi threw the steering wheel hard to the left, drifting the sports car into a narrow, rain-slicked alleyway with mere inches to spare. It was uncanny. They weren't just surviving a chaotic firefight, they were moving in an unspoken, synchronized rhythm. It was a lethal dance forged in milliseconds. When she needed him to suppress the pursuing motorcycles, she aggressively tapped the brakes to close the distance. When she heard the metallic click of his empty rifle, she immediately threw the car into a dizzying serpentine weave, dodging incoming fire to buy him the exact 3 seconds he needed to reload. Taejin slammed a fresh magazine home, the metallic clack lost under the roar of the engine. His blood was burning with an adrenaline cocktail he hadn't felt since his early days clawing his way up the syndicate ranks. He stole a glance at the woman behind the wheel. The submissive, invisible waitress was entirely gone. In her place sat an apex predator completely in her element. Her hands, delicate enough to serve bone china, gripped the leather wheel with violent, uncompromising authority. Taejin felt an intense, undeniable surge of awe that bordered on devotion. She wasn't his subordinate. She was his absolute equal. "Hold on," Naomi murmured, her voice an icy calm cutting through the chaos. She killed the headlights and ripped the emergency brake upward. The Porsche whipped into a brutal, sliding spin, tearing off the main avenue and plunging them into the pitch-black maw of an abandoned shipping tunnel. The remaining pursuing vehicles roared past the entrance, their sirens fading into the distance. Darkness swallowed them, leaving only the ticking of the cooling engine and the heavy, perfectly synchronized rhythm of their breathing. The abandoned syndicate safe house smelled of stale rain and forgotten dust. Hidden deep within the meatpacking district, it offered a temporary sanctuary from the sirens wailing across the grid. Naomi locked the heavy deadbolt, sliding the stolen rifle onto a wooden crate before leaning back against the cold steel of the door. For the first time since the espresso cup shattered in the lobby, she closed her eyes. The adrenaline that had fueled their flawless, violent escape was finally crashing, leaving behind a bone-deep, trembling exhaustion. Across the dim room, illuminated only by the amber glow of a distant street lamp filtering through the blinds, Taejin sat heavily on a cracked leather sofa. He watched her, his dark eyes tracing the harsh lines of fatigue on her face. "The plaza pays well," he said quietly, his voice a low rumble in the heavy silence. "But it doesn't pay enough to cover a $20,000 monthly wire transfer to the Hanel private care facility." Naomi's eyes snapped open. Her hand drifted instinctively toward the pistol at her hip. Tae-jin didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. "I own the network the hotel uses, Naomi. I see the transactions my employees make. I always wondered why a ghost was bleeding herself dry to keep someone in a luxury medical ward." He paused, the terrifying aura of the Mafia boss entirely dissolving into something profoundly gentle. "Who is she?" Her fingers slowly fell away from the gun. The sheer exhaustion stripped away the last of her carefully constructed armor. "My sister," she whispered, the confession tasting like ash in her dry mouth. "Maya. I burned my entire world down to keep her hidden. If I stop paying, they stop treating her. And if I step out of the shadows to use my actual skills to make real money, the people I used to work for will find us." Tae-jin stood. He closed the distance between them with a slow, deliberate grace, stopping only when he was close enough to share her next breath. The cold, damp air of the loft vanished, replaced by the radiating heat of his body. He reached out, his hand, rough and stained with the night's violence, gently cupping her jaw. "Listen to me," he murmured, his thumb lightly brushing a stray curl from her cheek. The vow in his eyes was absolute, heavier than any oath he had ever sworn to his empire. "If we survive this night, your sister will never want for anything again. She will have the best care in the world. And you will never have to hide in the dark to protect her. I will burn this city to the ground before I let anyone touch either of you." Naomi's breath hitched. The walls she had fortified for years crumbled under the fierce weight of his devotion. She looked up into his eyes, the magnetic, undeniable pull between them overwhelming every survival instinct she possessed. Tae-jin leaned in, his gaze dropping to her lips, the space between them closing to a breathless fraction of an inch. The heavy steel door behind her buckled inward with a deafening, concussive roar.
The heavy steel door buckled inward with a deafening, concussive roar, tearing off its hinges in a blinding flash of white light and pulverized concrete. Tae-jin moved on pure instinct, wrapping his arms around Naomi and throwing them both behind the reinforced bulk of a structural pillar just as a merciless grid of suppressed gunfire chewed through the space where they had been standing seconds before. There was no shouting, no chaotic spray of bullets typical of syndicate muscle, just a terrifying, synchronized silence punctuated by the mechanical, rhythmic hiss of perfectly placed double taps. Ears ringing, Naomi risked a fraction of a second to sweep the room through the reflection of a shattered mirror across the loft. Her breath caught violently in her throat. Through the swirling dust, she didn't see Min-soo's slick-suited enforcers. She saw phantoms clad in matte black ballistic armor, equipped with quad-node night vision, moving in a flawless, overlapping wedge formation. She recognized the silent, two-fingered tactical hand signals. She recognized the precise, calculated deployment of a secondary flashbang designed to herd them away from the fire escape. Then, a final figure stepped through the ruined doorway, moving with an arrogant, liquid grace. He didn't raise his rifle. He merely observed, tapping the comms unit at his throat. Naomi stared at the customized, serrated combat knife strapped horizontally across his chest rig. Vance, her former commander. The air vanished from her lungs. She slumped back against the pillar, the stolen pistol trembling in her grip for the very first time tonight. Tae-jin saw the sudden, violent shift in her demeanor. The unflinching apex predator who had driven a sports car through a war zone was gone, replaced by a ghost staring at her own executioner. "Naomi," Tae-jin rasped, his hand gripping her shoulder tight to ground her. "Who are they?" "It's not Min-soo's cleanup crew," she whispered, her voice entirely hollow. "It's Echo Company, my old unit. Min-soo didn't just find out who the Waitress was, he paid my nightmares to come finish the job." The devastating truth slammed into Taejin with the force of a physical blow. Min-soo had weaponized her past, but Echo Company wouldn't have known where to look unless a massive beacon had been lit. The realization shattered Taejin's remaining armor. By picking up that silver tray in the sky lobby, by choosing to step out of the shadows and between Taejin and a bullet, Naomi had deliberately burned her perfect camouflage. She had handed herself over to the monsters she had spent years running from, sacrificing her anonymity, her freedom, and her sister's safety, all to save the life of a mafia boss she barely knew.
The torrential rain masking the harbor was the only cover they had. Min-soo's stronghold, a sprawling shipping warehouse at the edge of the docks, bristled with the elite, matte black silhouettes of Echo Company. Naomi knelt in the shadows of a rusted shipping container, checking the magazine of her stolen rifle. She had told Taejin to run. She had told him this was a ghost story he didn't belong in. Instead, the mafia boss racked the slide of his own weapon, his shoulders soaked in blood and rainwater, and pressed his back against the corrugated steel beside her. "I don't leave what's mine behind," he had murmured, a vow that sent an undeniable shiver through her core. "I draw their fire, you cut the head off the snake." Before she could protest, Taejin broke cover. He didn't skulk in the shadows. He moved with the furious, magnetic gravity of a king tearing down his own castle. He stepped into the open loading dock and opened fire, a relentless, roaring barrage that instantly painted him as the primary target. Echo Company reacted with terrifying clinical precision, their targeting lasers converging on Taejin's position. But their flawless tactical discipline was their fatal flaw. They focused entirely on the loud, aggressive threat, entirely forgetting the invisible girl. Naomi breached through a shattered upper-level window, dropping onto the warehouse catwalks like a shadow detached from the night. The synchronized takedown was a beautifully violent ballet. While Taejin laid down punishing heavy cover fire from behind a forklift, drawing the unit's absolute attention, Naomi picked off the mercenaries from the flanks. They communicated in the terrifying instinctual language forged in the hotel descent. A shift in his suppressing fire meant she was dropping a level. A pause in his cadence meant he needed exactly 3 seconds to reload. She descended to the warehouse floor just as Vance, her former commander, drew his customized serrated combat knife from his chest rig. He smiled, a cold, arrogant expression of recognition. Naomi didn't hesitate. She didn't fight him with the disciplined honor he had beaten into her years ago. She fought with the brutal, unhinged desperation of a woman protecting the man she loved. She slipped under his sweeping blade, drove her boot through his kneecap, and buried her own stolen knife deep into the vulnerable gap of his armor. Vance collapsed, choking on his own hubris. Silence suddenly crashed over the cavernous warehouse, broken only by the steady drumming of rain on the metal roof. At the center of the room, Min-soo scrambled backward, his expensive suit ruined, his weapon clicking empty. Taejin kicked the gun away and grabbed the traitorous underboss by the throat, violently slamming him against a steel support beam. He pressed the barrel of his smoking pistol directly between Min-soo's trembling eyes. The old Taejin would have pulled the trigger instantly, but the man bleeding in the warehouse didn't care about his stolen throne. He turned his head, his dark, intense eyes finding Naomi as she stepped out of the shadows. He held Min-soo's life in his hands, but he waited, breathing heavily, offering her the absolute authority of the final nod. Naomi didn't hesitate. She looked at the pathetic, trembling man who had tried to weaponize her trauma, and then she met Taejin's fiercely devoted gaze. She gave a single, definitive nod. The deafening crack of Taejin's pistol echoed through the cavernous warehouse, ringing out over the relentless drumming of the rain. Min-soo's body slumped to the wet concrete, lifeless. It was over. The traitor was dead, and the ghosts of Echo Company lay scattered among the shipping crates, finally silenced by the woman they had trained to be invisible. The heavy steel doors at the far end of the loading dock screeched open. Dozens of syndicate enforcers, Taejin's true loyalists who would finally track their missing boss through the carnage of the city, swarmed into the dim light. They took in the absolute slaughter, elite mercenaries decimated, the underboss executed, and their king standing amidst the wreckage, battered but undeniably victorious. As one, the men lowered their weapons. The sounds of high-caliber rifles clattering against the concrete was followed by the synchronized, heavy thud of knees hitting the floor. Dozens of hardened criminals bowed their heads in the pooling rainwater and blood, swearing silent, absolute fealty to the reclaimed head of the empire. They waited for his command. They waited for him to assume the throne he had just fought so violently to keep. Taejin didn't even look at them. He dropped his smoking pistol. Ignoring the kneeling army that stretched out before him, he turned his back on his empire and walked with singular, consuming purpose toward the shadows. Naomi leaned heavily against the rusted forklift, the adrenaline finally leaving her bruised and exhausted body. Her stolen tactical rig was torn, her hands were slick with Vance's blood, and she could barely keep her eyes open. She watched Taejin approach, expecting the cold, calculated Mafia boss to reemerge now that his crown was secure. Instead, Taejin closed the distance between them, his dark eyes blazing with the raw, unfiltered emotion that stole the remaining breath from her lungs. He didn't say a word. He reached out with both hands, gripping the sides of her face, his thumbs smearing the ash and rain on her cheeks, and pulled her roughly against his chest. His mouth crashed down on hers in a fierce, desperate kiss. It was a collision of survival, exhaustion, and undeniable devotion. Naomi let out a soft, shuddering breath, dropping her stolen blade as her hands found the lapels of his ruined suit, gripping him just as fiercely as she kissed him back. The violence of the night melted away entirely, leaving only the burning, magnetic heat of two isolated souls who had finally found home in each other. Taejin held her as if letting go meant the world would end. In front of his kneeling, silent empire, the message was broadcast loud and clear, etched in blood and steel. The invisible waitress was gone forever. In her place stood his equal, his savior, and his queen, and she was absolutely untouchable. The heavy, suffocating smog of the city was a lifetime away, replaced by the brilliant, sun-drenched azure of the Mediterranean Sea. Naomi stood on the sprawling white stone terrace of a private cliffside villa, the gentle sea breeze catching the hem of her loose, breathtaking ivory silk dress. There was no starched collar choking her throat, no silver serving tray to anchor her to the shadows. For the first time in years, she simply existed in the light. She lifted a delicate porcelain cup to her lips, the rich aroma of espresso curling into the warm air. It was a quiet, domestic echo of the morning that had violently altered her destiny exactly 1 month ago. But everything had changed. The staggering medical debt that had chained her to the Plaza Hotel was erased. Maya was asleep in the villa's sunlit guest wing, surrounded by the finest private medical staff money could buy, and safe from any threat. The ghosts of Echo Company were buried in the rubble of a forgotten warehouse, and the invisible girl had died right alongside them. The soft, deliberate sound of footsteps echoed on the stone behind her. Naomi didn't tense. She didn't instinctively calculate the tactical vulnerabilities of the terrace or reach for a concealed weapon. The hypervigilance that had defined her entire adult life melted away into a profound, grounding peace. Taejin stepped into the sunlight, the harsh, merciless edges of the ruthless syndicate boss softened by the golden morning. He moved up behind her, sliding his arms seamlessly around her waist and pulling her back against his chest. With a soft exhale, he rested his chin on her shoulder, his dark eyes following her gaze out over the endless expanse of the water. "The European contacts have agreed to the new logistics protocols," he murmured, his voice a low, comforting rumble against her skin. He wasn't giving a report to an underling, he was consulting his partner. Naomi leaned back into his embrace, her hands resting gently over his. "Make sure they route the transition through the offshore shells I restructured. We don't leave footprints." Taejin smiled, the sound a soft vibration against her collarbone before he pressed a lingering kiss to the curve of her neck. He held her not as a possession, but as his absolute equal. The underworld empire that had once profoundly isolated him was now fiercely guided and guarded by the brilliant, deadly tactician in his arms. They ruled the shadows together, an untouchable force bound by gunpowder, sacrifice, and a deep, all-consuming love. Naomi closed her eyes, breathing in the salt air and the steady warmth of the man holding her. She was finally free, and she was never hiding again. If you felt the adrenaline, the tension, and the undeniable chemistry of Naomi and Tae-jin's story, don't let the journey end here. Hit that like button to show your support. Comment down below with your favorite intense moment or plot twist. Share this gripping neo-noir romance with your fellow fiction lovers. And be sure to subscribe so you never miss out on the next thrilling adventure.